Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Stalling, and I'm the Interim Dean of the David L. Boren College of International Studies. And on behalf of our college, as well as the Romanoff Center for Russian Studies here at the University of Oklahoma, it is my genuine pleasure to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker. It has already been, I think, a tremendous conference. I've been hearing from everyone who's been involved throughout the day. I know it's a pre-circulated papers, but even in the general discussions, as I understand, many people are learning a great deal. It is in moments like this, when geopolitical forces are so unhinged and so unpredictable, that having opportunities for leading scholars to be in the room with one another, to have sustained and deep conversation, is something that I'm extremely grateful for, and I wish I could have participated throughout the day, but I'm happy that so many have been able to do so. At a time when international affairs are shaken to their core, I think it's essential that we have opportunities like this. And so I'm very grateful to all the faculty, staff, especially to Dr. Hannah Chapman, the organizer of this symposium, but for all the staff who also participated in making this possible, thank you for that. And for our funders here at the David L. Boren College, thank you, as well as from the Romanoff Center. I just want to briefly introduce, although I know I'll have my esteemed colleague give a longer introduction to Dr. Pauline Jones, but she is Professor of Political Science, University of Michigan, and the Eden Goldberg Endowed Professor of the Michigan and Washington Program. Dr. Jones is a globally respected scholar whose work on state building, political institutions, and identity politics in post-Soviet Eurasia have profoundly shaped her field. Her insights into global implications of the war in Ukraine are particularly timely and vital. But to provide us with more of an introduction, I'd like to invite my colleague, Professor Melissa Stockdale, to join me here, or to, in fact, to take the stage. But before we do, I want to make sure that everyone here knows that you're invited for a further conversation and food in the David L. Boren Lounge, which is across the street in the Farzani Hall. So please don't just leave after this, but make sure we close the day fully with deeper and more sustained conversation. So thank you so much for joining, and for all who've made this day possible. Professor Stockdale.
Welcome. It's wonderful to see such a splendid turnout. As a brief practical aside, if you are one of the students in my class, before you leave today, the sign-in is over there. Thank you. So I spent a wonderful morning and afternoon listening to amazing discussion by specialists in Central Asia. I am a Russianist, but it is often the case that people who specialize in the Russian Federation or the history of the Russian Empire know this much about Central Asia. So it was enlightening to me. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce the keynote speaker, Professor Pauline Jones. As Professor Smalling said, she is faculty at the University of Michigan and is the founder and director there of the Digital Islamic Studies curriculum. Her work has contributed to understanding institutional change, economic development, and explaining the impact of religious regulation in Muslim-majority countries on citizens' political attitudes and behavior. She also examines the influence that evoking historical memory has on public support for foreign assistance. She is the author or co-author of 5 books, extremely impressive, the most recent being the Oxford Handbook on Politics in Muslim Societies, which came out with Oxford in 2021. She has published articles in numerous journals, including the American Political Science Review, Current History, Foreign Affairs, and Security Studies. And she recently learned that she is going to have an amazing experience in academic year 2025, having been selected as a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, where she is going to continue work on an ambitious project of study on authoritarianism around the world, what sadly could be more relevant right now. Thank you so much. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Professor Jones.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm realizing now that I actually have to stand here, don't I? Because the mic is stationary, and I'm a pacer. Can I take it out? Oh, fantastic. Okay, that will make my life so much easier, and yours. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone who made this possible. I especially want to thank my partner in crime here, Dr. Chapman. Amazing person, amazing scholar, and just the way you put all of this together was just fantastic. It was an absolute fantastic day. This is a fantastic campus. The introductions were wonderful. I'm very humbled by them. Thank you very much. And I also very much want to thank the College of International Studies and the Romanov Center for Russian Studies for making this possible, not just in terms of the funding, but the staff is amazing. Jennifer, if you could recognize yourself, thank you very much. Let me see if I can remember everybody else's name. Help me. Christine. Are you here? Thank you, Christine. See, third time I can't remember your name, Christine, but I know who you are. Thank you. And also, I want to thank Catherine, who helped us today, one of your amazing undergraduates who helped us today. Okay. Without further ado, I'm getting to the talk, and I'll try not to stand in front of it, but I do have to pace a little when I talk. So when Hannah and I were thinking about how to organize the symposium for today, we thought it would be a really great idea to have something that was, more public, to do a keynote. We didn't know at the time I was going to do the keynote. And we were thinking about how, even though the symposium was so focused on the regional implications of the war in Ukraine, which is extremely important and valuable, that there are global implications. And that maybe what we could do in the keynote was turn to these global implications. And I've done some work on this that I'm happy to talk about on my own. But this is really a compilation of other people's works and things that I've learned and things I'm thinking about. So I want to start with some basic facts. I think there's been a lot of misinformation when it comes to the war in Ukraine, and I'll talk a little bit more about sort of the sources of that later. But I do want to start with some basic facts that we're all on the same page when it comes to, we all have the same sort of baseline that we're working from when I start to comment on what the global implications of this thing are, what's happening in Ukraine. So first of all, Ukraine is an internationally recognized sovereign nation. It declared independence in 1991, August of 1991 to be exact. It's an interesting fact that at that time, the Russian president then, Boris Yeltsin, recognized Ukrainian independence, or recognized it as an independent sovereign state. In fact, the Ukrainian president at the time was one of the original signers of the treaty that was responsible for the breakup of the Soviet Union. I always tell my students, the Soviet Union did not break up at the sound of a gunshot, or the sound or the barrel of a gun, but with a stroke of a pen. Right? These four leaders for the former republics signed a treaty and created the Commonwealth of Independent States, and that's what broke up the Soviet Union. And Ukraine was one of those. The state at the time was one of the original signers. And then in December of the same year of 1991, that Declaration of Independence was approved by popular referendum. So completely legit, right? You don't need to have a doubt in your mind that Ukraine is a legitimate independent state and a recognized sovereign nation by its own neighbor, historically Russia. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that in 1994, together with Russia and the UK, Britain, the United States convinced Ukraine to sign the Budapest Memorandum. And what that meant was that they would, in exchange for giving up their nuclear arsenal, which was the third largest in the world at the time, right? So that's big, okay? In exchange for agreeing to give up their nuclear arsenal, that the three countries, Russia, Britain, and the US, would not only agree to respect the independence and sovereignty of the existing borders of Ukraine, but also that they would refrain from either the threat or the use of force against Ukraine. Okay? That's the first fact. The second is that Ukraine did not start this war. Okay? Now, to some of you who are experts in the room, you're going to say, yeah, that's obvious, but it's not something that has been always consistent in the media. Okay? But Ukraine, not only did Ukraine not start the war itself, the current war that we're seeing that really we think, or many think, began in February 2022, goes back to 2014. It goes back to 2014 when Russia also illegally violated Ukrainian sovereignty militarily, right? Seized and then annexed Crimea, which if you can see is does this have a little it does. So this is Crimea. So this is Ukraine, right? Just part of it. This is Crimea. This is eastern Ukraine. So both of these territories were seized in 2014, and Russia maintained control from 2014 forward, right? Flash forward to 2021. I'll get there in a minute. By essentially through these proxy states of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine, these people's republics that held sham referendums, where the people said they wanted to be independent and part of Russia. But the referendums themselves were never recognized by the international community. They were called sham referendums. Okay, now fast forward to the military buildups that again, so Russia escalated a war that was already in existence, right? The war, it started in 2014. There were lots of deaths and destructions as a result of this war, but then Russia decided in 2021 it was going to rebuild up its military, and it did two major buildups, one in March and April of 2021, and then one just before the actual invasion, the escalation of the war in February 2022. And then, because its hold on eastern Ukraine, so if you look at this is about a third, right? In 2014, Russia had about a third of eastern Ukraine, but that wasn't enough for Russia. Russia wanted all of it. So in addition to these people's republics, Russia also held sham referendums in, I believe, in November of 2022. In the other two major parts of eastern Ukraine, the most developed, Kherson and Zaporizhia. The other thing to know is that this war, when I say it wasn't started by Ukraine, I also mean that it wasn't in any way instigated by any propaganda or any aggression on the part of Ukrainian's president or on the part of the Ukrainian state. Instead, it was based on false claims made by Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, that Ukraine's not a real country, that its borders are not sovereign, that Ukrainians are not real people, are not separate people, and that therefore Russia had a right not only to invade, or at least Ukraine didn't have a right to stop Russia from invading, but also sort of manufactured, like he did in 2014 and continued to do, this desire on the part of part of the population in eastern Ukraine to be a part of Russia because they were being oppressed. The ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine were being oppressed. I guess I left that part of the story out. I'm sorry that this is a very heavily, not only is on the border of Russia, this region, but also has a large ethnic Russian population. Okay, everybody with me so far? That's only fact 2. I got a couple more. Yes, dear? These are regions within Russia. So this is Ukraine. This is part of Ukraine. There's the whole of Ukraine up here in the smaller part. This is eastern Ukraine, and the red is showing where Russia occupied as of 2014, and that's Crimea over here. So this is Ukraine, all of it. This is the Russian border. This is the recognized Russian border at the time in 2014, and this is what Russia was occupying after its seizure in 2014. Is that helpful? I am very happy to be interrupted with questions. That's not a problem at all. So thank you for asking that. All right. Fact 3. This is the largest, what is happening now in Ukraine is the largest and deadliest conflict in Europe since World War II. Just think about that. We have not had a war this big and this devastating in Europe since World War II. In terms of civilian deaths, we've had over more than 10,000 casualties. You know, these things are never exact because we can't always go in and count, but these are the counts that we have. So over 10 million in 10,000 in casualties, 10 million have been displaced, 10 million Ukrainians displaced all around the world, not by their own volition. It's also been a war, this is very important, in which Russia has blatantly violated international law and committed egregious war crimes, and these are documented. They're documented in a variety of ways. One, through the abduction of children, so taking Ukrainian children from their families. Sorry, I might get a little emotional. Taking Ukrainian children from their families and taking them to Russia and disappearing them. Their parents don't know where they are. There are violations of international law in terms of rape, torture, indiscriminate killings, mass graves. Buchta is one good example of this and is documented by the UN. Russia occupied Buchta in March of 2022, so just after the invasion. It's about 30 miles east of Kiev, the capital, and they were hoping to use it as a base from which to launch an assault on Kiev. They were thwarted by the local population, which is part of the reason for many of the deaths, because they were killing people indiscriminately they thought would oppose them. And the UN went in and was able to document this torture and mass killings in this region. So that's just one example, but you can multiply that by a large number. In addition, there's some cultural heritage theft, where Russia has taken things from Ukrainian museums. The estimate from the UN sources is like something like 3.5 million in terms of cultural heritage theft by Russia against Ukraine. Also a war crime. I didn't know that until I did some research. And then finally, something that is not necessarily a war crime, but it does make this war incredibly devastating, and one that's going to have lingering effects even after it ends, and that's the economic impact. So part of Russia's strategy, its military strategy, and its long-term, if you will, a colonial strategy or recolonization strategy, was to destroy Ukraine's economy, right? To destroy the agricultural sector, to do this by both destroying production so that it would lead to mass starvation among the Ukrainian people that couldn't feed themselves, but also damaging the export industry so that Ukraine couldn't export to other countries. And many developing countries depend on Ukraine for their food security, right? So this has led to food insecurity both domestically within Ukraine and globally for countries that depended on grain from Ukraine. It was one of the top 5 suppliers of some key grains, including wheat, barley, and maize. Right, and being in Oklahoma, you might relate to that a bit, how important that sector is. Right? Okay. Fact 4, and 5. I got 4 and 5 on one slide. We could, I'm sure, debate this for a long time because part of it depends on the metrics that you're using. But I would argue that the U.S. has not, in fact, spent more than Europe. It certainly hasn't spent more than the European Union. And per capita, some European states have spent much more than the United States. And the majority of what the United States has spent or contributed has been military aid as opposed to humanitarian aid. So that's something to think about. A lot of that helps our own economy and our own military sector. Okay? So we're not in any way, shape, or form wasting money on Ukraine, as has been said occasionally in the media again. And fifth, and this is my last fact before I move on to what I think the implications are, Zelensky is not a dictator, not even close. Okay, that's also been something that's been talked about in the media, or at least our own president, President Trump, has accused Zelensky of being a dictator, using, of course, the same rhetoric that Vladimir Putin uses. I'll talk about that some more later as well. Zelensky is, what is my evidence for Zelensky not being a dictator? Well, first of all, he was democratically elected. In fact, he won the largest share of the vote that any Ukrainian president has won. He was elected by over 70% in 2019. And he was elected on, this might not surprise you, a pro-EU, pro-Western agenda, right? That's why, one of the reasons why Putin doesn't like him too much. Russia doesn't like him too much. He has maintained high popular support throughout the war. This estimate of 55% is an average, looking across polls rather than giving you all the different polls. That's an average. So that's his average approval rate, at least since the summer of 2024. So he's doing quite well, one might argue. Wartime presidents usually aren't that popular, at least at this stage in a war. And there's a reason why he's not holding elections. You cannot hold elections during wartime. In fact, Ukraine's constitution forbids him holding elections when they're under a state of national emergency or national martial law. Okay, so any questions so far? Okay. So I want to be clear that when I talk about implications, and I thought about this a lot, so implications from what, right? You might think implications, from a lot of things, from several things that I talked about. One could be, Russia escalating this war that it started in 2014, right? That Europeans have called an unjustified and naked act of aggression. So you might think, well, that's what she means by implications. What are the implications when one country blatantly violates another country's sovereignty in defiance of international law and commits war crimes? Then it could be the means of warfare. I talked a lot about the war crimes, the devastation of the economy. So maybe what we're really concerned about is not so much just the violation of sovereignty, but we're concerned about the way in which the war has been conducted and the fact that it's been so deadly and devastating. Okay, and will have long-term effects. But I think, for me, what's most staggering about this war, and what I see as the real source of the implications to follow, the global implications to follow, is the level of threat that this pertains to the international system, to the pre-existing international system. What we have witnessed in just the last few months has been a dramatic shift in U.S. policy, an absolutely dramatic shift in U.S. policy. So it's not just that Russia invaded, and it's not just that Russia is violating international law, it's that we are now siding with Russia. The United States is aligning with Russia in this war now, right? And why do I say that? What is my evidence? Why would I argue that we've made this dramatic shift and that we're siding with Russia? In fact, some would argue, not just me, there's lots of others that would argue, that are even more experts, have more expertise than I do, that we're actually siding, we want the outcome of the war, right? So we want the war to end. We, and I mean the US government, I don't mean me personally or you in the room, that the position the US government is taking now is that the war should end, but that end should benefit Russia and Vladimir Putin. Why do I say this? Well, our president, President Trump, is repeating and endorsing Russian propaganda about the war. He's saying, Ukraine started it, that's what Putin says. He's saying Zelensky's a dictator, that's what Putin says. Okay, so he's repeating and endorsing Russian propaganda from the Oval Office. He's making concessions to Russia before the peace negotiations even began, right? He agreed that we would not let Ukraine join NATO before they even sat down at the table to negotiate an end to the war. So that suggests that he's giving away what could be major concessions before they need to be given away, and something that Russia desperately wants. That was another accusation that Russia made, Vladimir Putin made, that it's the West's fault, right? The war, I didn't include this on my basic facts, but I'll include it now, that it's the West's fault, the invasion of, or escalation of war against Ukraine, because we were going to bring Ukraine into NATO. And that was a threat against Russia, so it's our fault. Right? So again, he's reaffirming, if you will, that misinformation coming out of Russia. Third, the current administration of the United States is undermining Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia. How? Taking away military aid that it was already promised and cutting off its intelligence. Right? The intelligence is a lifeline, even more so than the military aid. Okay. Fourth, we are actively destroying, and again, we, the US government, not we in this room, as actively destroying the US-European partnership that has been key to peace and stability for 80 years. We are actively going against defying the Europeans. The Europeans want to continue to support Ukraine and to stand up to Russia in this war. And finally, as you saw, if you witnessed the, I don't know if you want to call it interview, negotiation, interrogation, but the episode in the Oval Office with Zelensky, President Zelensky of Ukraine, President Trump, and Vice President, gosh, what is his name? Vance. Thank you. And Vice President Vance, right? That they're actively demeaning and discrediting Zelensky on the stage. And one of the ways they're doing that is by calling Zelensky a dictator, right? This came out the next day in the New York Post. Like I said, it's not just me. President Trump, this is a dictator, right? That's a picture of Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. And then the article goes on to, and 10 other Ukraine war truce we ignored our peril. Okay, I highly recommend that article if you haven't seen it. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say, what are the implications? What are the implications of this dramatic shift in US policy away from an ally and a group of allies toward what we considered to be an adversary, right? At least we did in November, I think in November 2024. Okay. So what's at stake? I'll be specific about, and here I only have 4 things. I was raised Catholic, so I usually like to do things in 3s. but for some reason it didn't work with this talk. Okay, so the first thing that's at stake is the principle and the reality of sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean, right? If one country, a bigger country, can overtake a smaller country, and another big country in the world says it's okay, right? So just to give you, a definition, territorial integrity is something that's widely recognized. It's an international principle, and it protects states, or it's supposed to protect states, and it's a principle, right? These norms are really important here, right? You have to enforce norms. Norms can't enforce themselves. But this is a norm. It's a principle. It's an international principle. It's a principle of international law, and it protects states against involuntary loss of territory to other states. Would you not call what happened in 2014 and what's happened in 2022 to Ukraine an involuntary loss of its territory to another state? The principle of territorial integrity is enshrined in Article 2 of the UN Charter, which we have signed. It's directly linked to the notion or the principle of state sovereignty, because you can't have sovereignty if you don't have territorial integrity. Hopefully that's pretty intuitive, right? And sovereignty, I would argue, is absolutely essential to global security, to global stability, right? You can't constantly have countries, whether they're bigger or smaller, redrawing the boundaries of other countries and expect to have any kind of global stability. It will be absolute and utter chaos. Now, of course, there have been previous violations of state sovereignty, not just by Russia, but these are two recent ones by Russia, right? Since 1991, Russia violated the sovereignty of Moldova in 1992 and in Georgia in 2008, when, again, it did something similar in that it sort of instigated independence movements, if you will, or took advantage of proto-independence movements in these countries, and then helped to annex territories or assert control over territories and kind of fuel the conflicts, right, to maintain that kind of instability, but also control, most importantly, territorial control over those parts of these countries, parts of Moldova, Transnistria, and parts of Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. Those are very complicated histories, but the point is that it isn't the first time. 2014 is not the first time that Russia violated one of its neighbors' sovereignty. It wasn't the last time, and as I'll talk about in just a second, it probably isn't going to be the last time. So even though these previous violations have occurred, to me, I would say even more so than 2014, the most recent, the 2022 violation of sovereignty, the February 2022 violation of sovereignty, is a critical test, an absolute critical test for our system, our principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty. Why? This was an absolutely blatant disregard for Ukraine's sovereignty. Not just renewing this aggression, this military buildup that was actually over almost a year, right? Just defying that anybody would stop them from renewing this aggression over Ukraine and permanently controlling both Crimea and eastern Ukraine, but also claiming that Ukraine really had no right to protect itself because it wasn't actually a sovereign, independent nation, right? Those are the claims that were made, and Putin used to justify the attacks. Since, not just since the renewed aggression against Ukraine in February 2022, but since this dramatic shift in US policy, you've seen an uptick in Putin's claims against its other neighbors, against Georgia, against Kazakhstan, and now East Berlin, because, quote from a press conference with Putin last week, "We've won the Cold War, we want Berlin back." The perception in Russia is that they have won the Cold War. The other thing that many people are concerned about, myself included, is global copycat. So it won't just stop there. It's not just that Russia won't stop at Ukraine, right? It wants Kazakhstan, it wants Georgia, and maybe Berlin. Maybe that was hyperbole, maybe not. I take it seriously. But that you'll have other global copycats. And these global copycats, I mean, one that really common that people talk about is China and the possibility of China deciding, okay, now it's time to seize Taiwan. Because guess what? If you can't stop Russia, you can't stop China. Right? And you have our own president of the United States talking about seizing territory that from countries that do not want to voluntarily give it up, relinquish it. Greenland, right, for example. He stopped talking about the Panama Canal. I guess that's good. But talking about seizing Canada, right, our neighbor to the north. So there can be global copycats. This is why global stability so much depends on the respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. Okay. What else is at stake? So I mentioned that part of what the dramatic shift in U.S. policy has been under President Trump has been really an end to this U.S.-European alliance, right? Not just NATO, but a kind of, if you will, an all-encompassing economic, political, pro-economic development, stability, democracy, right? I'm not saying it's perfect. You can completely criticize the way that U.S. and Europe have oriented themselves toward the war, and toward the world, and development and democracy, and they haven't always been fair to every country on the planet. That's for sure. But this is a game changer because the U.S. has essentially realigned with Russia, and that's the way Russia sees it. Whether we see it or not like that in this country, that's the way Russia sees it. It's all over the media in Russia that, again, they've won the Cold War, and Putin and Trump are pals. And they're thanking Trump, right? They're thanking Trump for their victory in the Cold War. These are the kinds of pictures that you see in the Russian media, right? So I said it's not just NATO, right? It's a more kind of global alliance, an alliance that says we have common interests. We have common interest in a stable global order, in international trade, right, which promotes the global order, and in peace and security, which we think we can achieve not just through economic development, but also through democracy and promoting democracy. And I'll get to that next. But it also, the alliance is also military. Right, and the NATO alliance is under threat, right? Because NATO's expanded to include countries that could be attacked by Russia, including Finland. Finland's also on the list, as well as Estonia, right? And if Russian aggression does spread to one of those NATO partners, and we do not intervene to defend them, which we are obligated to do as a NATO partner, the NATO alliance is effectively over. There's also been, I think, and this is going to be a sort of more academic, intellectual point than it is kind of a current events point. I think there's been a disruption of the basis for alliance. I think there's a questioning about why we form alliances, why we should be partners, friends with other countries. Again, it used to be this common notion that we all support economic development, democracy, stability, etc. Not every country in the world benefited from that. I'm not making that claim, but that was the basis for the alliance between the US and Europe. Now, the argument is, there are two arguments. They're competing arguments, but they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. There I go with the academic terms. But the first is, the alliance is ideological. So it's not about economic development democracy per se, which also to some extent you could say is ideological, but it's about right-wing populism, right? That's the basis for these new alliances. The right-wing populists ally with one another. Orban of Hungary, Erdogan of Turkey, Trump of the United States, they band together and they form an alliance of their interests, which is about pushing their own values on their countries and the world, right? They're sort of uninclusive, if you will, nationalist values. Okay. But there's another argument, which is also interesting, and says this isn't ideological at all. It's not about ideology. It's about kleptocracy. It's about the money. It's about leaders that want to maintain their wealth at any cost and want to make sure that that wealth is maintained at the top for the few across countries, irrespective of ideology. We don't have to agree. We don't have to believe in the same things. We're not fighting for, ethno-nationalism. That's not what this is about. It's about making sure we can use ethno-nationalism as a vehicle, certainly, but it's really about making sure that the wealthy stay wealthy and that we control the wealth, right? And that's this book, if you're interested, Ann Applebaum, The Dictators Who Run the World, Autocracy, Inc., right? That's what makes us friends. We all want to stay rich. Okay. Number 3, I told you I'd get to democracy. I know, it's not a happy talk. I'm sorry. But, at the reception, we can try to drink our sorrows away, I guess. All right. So, number 3 is global democracy. So, those of us, again, this is very academic, but also very much about current events. Those of us who study democracy and autocracy know that there is a global trend toward democracy. And I could show you lots of different indicators, because they all point at the same thing, right? That whereas we witnessed a peak in democratizing countries after 1991, breakup of the Soviet Union, we have now have a reverse trend, a reverse wave of democracy, a trend toward autocratization, right? So that there are more autocratizers, more countries moving toward autocracy than there are countries moving toward democracy, right? By 2017, we had more autocratizers than democratizers for the first time since 1940, right? So, World War II, again, pre-World War II. I keep mentioning that because the context is very relevant. And if you want to know sort of what this means in real terms, think about it. In 2003, you had 35 countries that were democratizing, 18 countries that are autocratizing. In 2003, you had 11 countries that were autocratizing and 42 countries that are, 11 countries that are democratizing and 42 countries that are autocratizing. So you have a flip from 2003 to 2023.
Dr. Jones, would we consider America being autocratic now?
That's my next slide. I did not plant him, by the way. I did not. But your questions are fantastic. So, we're part of this trend. The United States is part of this trend. There's no U.S. exceptionalism when it comes to this. We should see what's happening in the United States as part of this global trend. And maybe it's ideological. Some people say it is. It's ethno-nationalist, right-wing populism. And maybe it's about accumulation of wealth at the very top, or maybe it's some combination of those two. But irrespective of that, there's a consensus that the U.S. has been backsliding since roughly 2016, 2017, but that has become steeper, right? That decline has become steeper since 2016, 2017, and even steeper since 2020, right? So across all 3 indices, and the other political scientists in the room can comment on this, The Economist is a pretty conservative indicator of democracy. Freedom House, that's 11 points, that's the middle one, and this one here is the varieties of democracy, which is probably the most complex of the indicators. But across all of those indicators, and we can talk about definitions of democracy as well, but across all the 3 main indices that are most used by academics and policymakers alike, there's a consensus that the U.S. is part of this global trend toward autocracy. Yes?
You were comparing it with the trend that was happening in the 1940s with the rise of fascism. I think most people agree that that was caused mainly by the Great Depression. Do you think, what are the underlying causes behind this global trend towards autocracy?
That's a great question. Maybe we'll get to that in the Q&A so I can really answer it more fully. But I guess what I wasn't necessarily giving a cause behind this. What I was just saying is that we've witnessed a reversal right? And for the first time since 1940, we've seen more autocratizers than democratizers. Why is that? You're right that it's connected to an economic collapse. And that's what many people are afraid of now, that we're going through potentially not just a global recession, but an economic collapse that could be worse than the Great Depression, and that could trigger, as you're saying, or reinforce a trend that's already occurring toward fascism. But I don't want to give a long explanation about the origins of fascism in World War II.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I'm just wondering what factors you consider when defining autocracies and like democracies.
Okay, great question. So, as I said, these indices use different, or these metric, they use different metrics. These indices are based on different metrics, right? But to me, but they're all based mostly on a procedural definition, at least the first two. And I tend to use a procedural definition in my own work. Now, what do I mean by that? To me, democracy is about process. It's not about outcomes. So it's about, it's a system in which leaders are elected through free, fair, and competitive elections, and operate under constraints both from civil society, but also from checks and balances. So institutional and societal constraints on a leader's power. That to me is a democracy. So it's not about what policy comes out of that process, right? You can have different policies. Some are, more conservative, some are more liberal. It's about the process whereby you get to those policies. And that's why what's happening in the US is so alarming to many people, because the current administration is not following a democratic procedure, a democratic process. It's not respecting the rule of law. That's what's concerning people, and that's what they're picking up here, right? That the checks and balances are not operating. This whole notion of not recognizing the loss of an election in 2020, that is a harbinger of autocracy, that an incumbent does not willingly give up power. Right? So that's one of the main reasons I think the U.S. dipped so dramatically in 2020, right, by these indicators. But they're consistent across countries. So what they're saying about the U.S., they're using the same types of indicators across all countries, including the U.S. Again, it's not U.S. exceptionalism. They're not using different metrics for the U.S. Okay. Did that answer your question? Okay, great. Okay, so why does this matter? Maybe it's obvious, and I don't even need to tell you. U.S. is part of this global trend toward autocracy. Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, unless you count Russia as part of Europe in terms of landmass, right? Ukraine's a very large country. It's the largest democracy, right? It is a democracy. Zelensky was democratically elected. Again, procedural definition, right? The U.S. is not just no longer supporting democracy in terms of not supporting, not getting behind Ukraine. Ukraine's our ally, our democratic ally. So in terms of supporting Russia, which is an autocracy, versus Ukraine, right? It's abandoning Ukraine. But it's also no longer really seen as a model for democracy. I didn't include this, but public opinion around the world that used to see U.S. very much as a model for democracy, something you aspire to, are no longer viewing, this is a Pew study, Pew poll, are no longer viewing the U.S. in that way. And Americans no longer see the United States as a model, a global model for democracy. So it's not supporting democracy, not just in this one sense that it's abandoning Ukraine, which I think is very important. As I said again, it's like the largest democracy in Europe, and Europe at least used to be we used to have a strong alliance with Europe, but we're also abandoning our soft power. We're giving up our soft power, right? The power through which we were able to influence, human rights and democracy throughout the world through things like the United States Agency for International Development, where we gave aid, right? Small amount of money, tiny amount of money in the U.S. federal budget that went toward building goodwill around the world through helping people, right? But also things like Radio Free Europe, Free Liberty, Radio Free Europe, Free Liberty. Thank you, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that would actually promote a U.S. narrative, right? Pro-democracy, pro-capitalism, right? not necessarily in that order. That kind of narrative, right? So that was our soft power. Convince people that we're the good guys. Convince people we're on their side. And meanwhile, give them some developmental aid, right? Help farmers farm, right? So USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, which has been completely gutted, was a huge source and a very inexpensive source of U.S. soft power, as was Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Okay. Why did I put Czechoslovakia in 1938? When I say why this matters, I think about the moment we're at historically, which I think is very much the moment that Chamberlain was at in 1938, when he decided that Czechoslovakia was small and irrelevant, and to give a piece of Czechoslovakia to Hitler wouldn't make a difference. It wouldn't matter, and it would stop him. Right? It's a small piece of Europe, small piece of a country. We appease Hitler, and he stops. This is the moment we're at historically. This is Ukraine. It's worth thinking about. And finally, I think our security is at stake. I think our security is threatened not just in a physical sense, but also very much in a psychological sense, right? I think a lot of people, this is not scripted at all. A lot of people I think are feeling very insecure and uncertain about the future right now, and that's for good reason. One of the reasons why I think our security is under threat is this notion that there could be an end to sovereignty, the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity, right? This could increase threats to physical security. And as a result, and this is already happening, countries feel that they need to take their own security into their own hands. Landmines are coming back. Right? Finland's talking about revoking the landmine treaty, which says that they will not use landmines because they don't believe in U.S. security guarantees. Right? If Ukraine can't rely on the United States to back it, why should we? Right? Even though we might be a NATO partner. So there's that kind of insecurity. There's an insecurity from these shifting alliances, right? That the alliances are shifting to such a degree that former allies have to find other partners. And they will. They'll find other partners. They have to. So they'll move away from the United States as a partner. We'll lose partners globally. Whereas former adversaries will start setting the rules of the game. So rather than the U.S., so the beauty of the global order that we lived under post-World War II till the present was that the U.S. pretty much set the rules of the game, and it did it in its interests, but its interests happened to be promoting economic development and democracy. Right? Those may no longer be the U.S. interests, but never mind anyway, we've stepped aside, so our former adversaries, whether it's Russia or it's China, can now set the rules of the game internationally. Right? My colleagues in international relations talk a lot about the threat of multipolarity, something that they worry about increasing the likelihood of nuclear war. When you have two, either one big hegemon or two powers, and the world is pretty symmetrically divided between those two powers, you're less likely to have nuclear proliferation, right? You're less likely to have interstate war, right? Because those two powers will police the other powers. But once you start to have multipolarity, lots of poles of influence, not just two or one, but many, you start to have nations. This is historically and theoretically, I don't want to say proven, but this is a theory we've had out there a long time with lots of empirical data, that you tend to get these smaller states wanting to acquire their own nuclear weapons, right? When I talk to Ukrainian leaders, one of the things they say they regretted most was something I started with, giving up their nuclear weapons in 1994. They say we never should have done that. And others are saying we should now acquire it. We're not going to stop at landmines. We want to have our own nuclear weapons so that we can protect ourselves. Because again, we can't rely on a U.S. security guarantee. We've got to take it into our own hands, and that's going to cause insecurity for the entire world. Okay, and then finally, global autocratization. I've probably talked enough about this already, but I think that with the rise of authoritarianism around the world, there are going to be greater threats to our personal security, to the ability of society to push back. There'll be threats not just to us as groups to mobilize, but as individuals, right? Feeling a lack of personal trust is also always something that undermines our ability to coordinate and to mobilize collectively, right? We start not to trust each other. We don't want to build civil society. There's also going to be a lot less respect for international norms, right? Or, as I said, those international norms are going to be so different that they're not going to be norms that are going to protect personal security, right? They're going to be norms that are set by our adversaries. So we can expect, not just a proliferation of nuclear weapons, but a greater use of nuclear weapons when international law and international norms are not respected. And we can expect more human rights violations without someone or something pushing back. Now, I'm going to end with a somewhat hopeful story about Poland. Poland is a country that suffered from deep democratic backsliding in a situation in which an executive came in and tried to destroy democratic institutions by hollowing them out, and was almost successful until that incumbent lost an election. Since then, Poland has been struggling to rebuild its democracy. Poland needs more than anything for the rest of the world to support, and particularly Europe and the United States, to support its rebuilding of its democracy. Right? So it's not just about Ukraine, it's about other countries that are trying to come back from these sort of this wave of autocratization, rebuild their democracies, and are looking to other larger countries like the United States, but also countries in Europe, to help them. So there is a possibility of making a comeback, right? But one country can do it alone, right? It requires sort of a global consensus about the direction that we want the world to go into. And I talking to some friends in Poland recently, and they reminded me of how important it is to have international backing. Same with Brazil. Brazil also made a comeback, but it was supported with international partnerships and international recognition. And when the incumbent lost the election, the international community getting behind the incumbent, when the incumbent lost the election, the international community getting behind the opposition. So all of those things. So it takes a village, right? Or it takes an international system. We need to be on the same page here and helping these democracies. So I guess I would say, as goes Ukraine, but also as goes Poland, so does the rest of Europe and possibly the rest of the world. Anyway, I was trying to be hopeful. And that's all I have. Questions?
Going around. So if you have a question, please just raise your hand, just introduce yourself, and then we will hand you the mic. So we'll start over here.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. It was lovely. My question for you is, so obviously recognizing that Russia is the instigator of this war, going back to the 2007 Munich conference, we saw Putin make these threats against NATO expansion eastward. And that's, before the invasion in 2008 of Georgia, before Crimea. And so my question to you is, do you think that the international community reacted correctly or as they should have when those threats were made? Or do you think that there's more that could have been done?
Excellent question. I'm so impressed with the students at this university, I have to say. They clearly didn't do enough. Right? They clearly should have responded. And I believe Obama was the president at the time, and people were very critical of the fact that he didn't respond strongly enough. I think that in 2014, after 2014, when Putin seized Crimea and then held those sham referenda in Donetsk and Luhansk, there was a treaty, a Minsk treaty, that was signed that required many things that Russia was supposed to do, and one was to demilitarize eastern Ukraine, and it was never implemented. It was never followed. That's the fault of the international community, no question, absolutely. So there were I don't want to say red lines that were drawn. There were pink lines, that were drawn, and they were crossed, and we should have done a lot more. But just because we didn't do a lot more when we should have doesn't mean we can't now or shouldn't now, right? I actually think, and this is very controversial, I know, but I'm clearly not afraid of controversy. I think that if Ukraine had been part of NATO, if we'd actually invited Ukraine into NATO, this war never would have happened. So it's not the possibility of Ukraine. I know this wasn't your question, but I want to say in terms of doing more, I think if we had offered Ukraine a path to NATO, or it had been already a partner, right, after 2014, that's one way we could have responded, that Russia never would have launched this aggression in 2022. It would have been far too dangerous for Russia to do that because Putin does not want a NATO ally to retaliate. And that's what would have had to have happened in 2022 had Ukraine been part of NATO.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much for your talk, which I enjoyed thoroughly. This is a hypothetical question, and I don't know if you can answer it. I hope you can. Can you foresee when this special military operation, this Russian special military operation, will be over in the Ukraine?
I will do my best.
Thank you.
I do not have a crystal ball, but I will do my best. That's a great question. So I think when Putin gets everything he wants. I think he essentially wants the territory he's already seized. All of eastern Ukraine, he's already has Crimea, and to be able to have a pro-Russian government installed in those regions, in those places. I think that's what Putin wants, and I think that what President Trump seems to want, and again, I can't get inside his head, and I don't want to, but I think what he wants is to end the war, right? He wants to win a Nobel Peace Prize. That's what he wants. He wants to end the war, not because he's worried so much about the devastation, but he really wants a Nobel Peace Prize, and he's made that clear. So he also knows, I think, that Putin doesn't really have much incentive to end the war, right? The status quo serves him fairly well. So Putin will continue to try to get as many concessions out of Trump as he can. But number one is he does not want to lose the territory that he believes is rightly part of Russia.
You mentioned how you thought this was a similar situation to like the appeasement with Czechoslovakia. I was wondering why you kind of like chose that moment in particular compared to, like the thing that came to my mind was like the Treaty of Moscow ending the Winter War and kind of that sort of Finlandization, and how like this could be an example of like Putin wanting to like neutralize a state but not necessarily get into a bigger war, and why you think this is more relevant to Czechoslovakia and kind of on the verge of the World War rather than like just that being the end of the violence.
Another great question, because I was looking at it from the perspective of the Allies and their response. I was looking at the perspective from the developed democracies and their response, right? So to say, as Chamberlain did at the time, that it's just a small part of a country, it doesn't matter, just the appeasement, right? That was going to be enough, that was going to be sufficient, and that it wasn't going to have the type of impact that he expected. That instead it was going to end. It was going to be the cessation of violence. To just give them a peace and give them Czechoslovakia, give the Germans Czechoslovakia, is very similar to how some people are talking about Ukraine. It's just a small country. It's not. It's not a democracy. It is. But regardless, let's just let Russia have what it wants, and then Russia will stop, and we can all go back to having global peace, security, and stability. I don't think that's what's going to happen if Putin gets what he wants in Ukraine. And I don't think we should let that happen. And I think the lesson, one of the, probably more than, that's not maybe the only lesson, but it's the lesson that comes to my mind, is 1938, Czechoslovakia. I'm letting you choose.
Pauline, I wanted to push you on 1938 as well. So
okay, great.
I was going to hold off, so 1938 was a reluctant appeasement, right? some people have been arguing that this is actually that Trump is of the same worldview of Putin, and that he supports a world where strong powers take things, right? And so this isn't a reluctant appeasement, but rather an embracing of an autocrat who sees a world. So I wanted to see if what your reaction was, and if that maybe has implications for your interpretation. That was point one. And point two is, you noted that the Russia, Putin, has faulted the United States for fomenting the war with this discussion of potential NATO expansion. Two things. One, not only Russia has done this, but American scholars have done the same thing. So I wanted you to kind of address that line of reasoning within the U.S. scholarship in international relations. And to your point, where you said you ran the counterfactual that had the United States and Europe included Ukraine and NATO earlier, this wouldn't have happened. If that's your logic, might there be some validity to people like Mearsheimer saying Russia saw the writing on the wall and they wanted to get out ahead of your logical conclusion that if Ukraine were part of NATO, they wouldn't have been able to exert influence over Ukraine. So maybe that was a logical response to the slow creeping invitation of Ukraine into NATO.
Okay, let me start with 1938. So again, the analogy for me is not for someone who shares Putin's worldview, right? That's not the utility of the analogy for me. Like, I'm not going to convince Trump with this analogy, right? But I might convince somebody with that analogy who actually cares about the future of democracy and security, and is concerned with the rise of fascism, right? That's the lesson that they would take from that. So that's why I use that analogy, or that's why I decided to use that analogy. Now I'm already forgetting the second question. I'm gonna jump to Mearsheimer because I think in some ways he's a scholar of international relations at Chicago, right? Just so everybody in the room knows who he is. Yeah, there's been an argument out there that Russia was anticipating the joining of that these countries would join NATO. That Russia perceived that as a threat, or they perceived it as a security threat, and that it was a preemption to these countries joining NATO. So we needed to take NATO off the table in order to take away that perceived security threat. I mean, the problem with the logic of that argument, of course, is that it's not falsifiable, right? It's completely not falsifiable. And it pushes me to say, well, we should have offered it even earlier. Why wasn't it offered in 1991 or 1992, right? Why did we wait to even think about it until 2008 or 2007, rather? Why did we wait to think about it till 2007? And I think that in 2014 we should have stood our ground and enforced the Minsk Agreement, the Minsk Accord, which we didn't do in Ukraine, and made part of that. We could have at that point. I mean, I'm not a security scholar, and I'm certainly not a expert on foreign policy, but we could have made it a condition, right, at that point, right? And we didn't. So I'm not one who thinks that these countries becoming independent from the former Soviet Union, right, or as part of the former Eastern Bloc, that they should not have been entitled to the self-determination of wanting to be part of a security alliance that will protect them from Russia. Right? To me, it's blaming the victim. Right? They had good reason to want to be part of the NATO alliance, and it could have been Russia that reassured us that they were not going to invade, that they were going to respect the sovereignty of their nation, of their neighbors, and not invade. And they didn't do that either. Right? So.
Okay, sorry, let's go. We'll start over there, then we'll come back. Yeah. She'll go first, then we'll go.
All right. So I have a question regarding, so the U.S. is pulling further away from Europe, and do you see a revival of the initiative from the 1950s of the European defense community? If so, how do you think they will handle Putin's further aggression?
No, I think this is a great question too. So I think that, I don't know that they're going to revitalize the European Defense Commission. I don't know exactly what their plans are, but I think Europe is already responding in a very, kind of positive, thoughtful, collective way. I mean, first of all, they've doubled down on, like I said, the U.S. is not actually giving more money than Europe to Ukraine, or hasn't in the past under Biden. They're doubling down on their aid. They're going to continue to support Ukraine both militarily and humanitarily. So that's one thing. But they also made a commitment to increase their contribution to NATO, which is one of the things that President Trump really wanted, was for the Europeans to spend more. And they, in fact, have recognized that if they want to keep any kind of alliance, right, alive, that they need to make a serious, not just economic contribution, but a commitment, right? Europe for a long time has been able to rely, again, going back to rely on the U.S. as their security guarantee. And going forward, they know that they I shouldn't say they know, they feel, they acknowledge that they can't rely on, or they shouldn't rely on that security guarantee, that it's not a reliable security guarantee the way it used to be. So they are mobilizing, right, so they can protect themselves. And you could argue that that's a really great thing for Europe. You could also argue that it's not a great thing that it's no longer a transatlantic alliance, because even though we do have an ocean between us, right, we very much rely on the peace, security, and stability of Europe. Right?
You mentioned that you thought it would have been a good idea to have Ukraine join NATO in 2013, or a few other dates you give. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Putin announce that if Ukraine were to join NATO, it would automatically mean war with the West? I mean, it seems kind of like a very risky bluff to call if we were to try and admit Ukraine into NATO.
So you're correct. He said that several times, and not just about Ukraine, about any of his neighbors. He didn't want any of his neighbors to join NATO, and including not just the contiguous countries, but also parts of East Central Europe. He didn't want Poland or Hungary to join NATO either, and they did join NATO, but they joined very early. So I think that we should have had a broader. Again, I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm sure someone in the room who has that expertise will give me all the reasons why this couldn't have happened in the early 90s, right? Before these types of threats were made, before Russia, revitalized its military and built up its economy and had the ability to launch the kinds of military campaigns that it's been launching, that we should have expanded NATO or found a way to provide the same security guarantees we used to provide to Europe to what was the former Soviet Union and the former Eastern Bloc. That's a pretty bold statement, but I think that would have been a huge deterrent to the type of aggression that we've seen on the part of Russia. And now there is really no deterrent that I can see.
Dr. Jones, amazing stuff. I think your slide should be on the podcast, because there is hints that we have been spending all this money on these people and Europe has not done anything, but these slides are great. I have two questions. One is about this sovereignty you talk about. Isn't that also an analogy for Palestine? And the second question is that this impression of winning the Cold War, is it a Putin scenario or is it a Russian scenario? When will that Russians grow up and say, hey, past is past and let's move on?
So, I mean, the issue of sovereignty and Palestine is complicated because, I started off by saying, look, Ukraine is a internationally recognized sovereign state, right? That's not the case, right? In terms of Palestine, it doesn't have the same level of international recognition, right? And we can debate about whether it should or not, but it doesn't in the real world, right? So I'm not advocating that some countries' sovereignty or borders should be violated and not others. That some countries have territorial integrity and not others, right? But in this case, it's clear that this was a violation of territorial integrity and that it was internationally recognized as a sovereign state, right? So that's the point that I'm trying to make. In terms of the Cold War and perceptions of the Cold War, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting debate and longer conversation. My impression, and my colleagues who are experts can please give their impressions, but my impression is that for Russia, the Cold War has never been over. I mean, they think it is now, and they've won. And the reason why, in their perceptions, at least the leadership, it wasn't over, is because they were losing. So it's only over now that they've won, right? But to them, the Cold War didn't really end in 1991 when we think it did, right? Because they were still seeing themselves as our adversary, right?
I wanted to ask, so let's say in the next couple months, but maybe by the end of the year, maybe by the end of the Trump administration, Ukraine falls and Russia completely annexes Ukraine. What do you see changing in Russia's strategy? Do they push further west? Do they turn their eyes elsewhere? How does their long-term strategy change given that this war has gone so differently from what they initially expected and given the current state of affairs with the Trump administration and warming with the U.S.?
So you're saying, what was the first part of your question, though, that they would take all of Ukraine? Is that what you're saying?
Like in the hypothetical where Ukraine does fall to Russia, Russia does win this war, what does Russia do?
What do you mean by fall to Russia, though?
Like, let's say complete annexation.
Of the entire country?
Maybe a satellite state, maybe like territorial control.
I think it's unlikely that, at least in the short term, that Russia will take the entire country, though he will want to set up a proxy government or a pro-Russian government. Yeah, I mean, I really don't want to predict the future because I don't have a crystal ball. I just think that if Putin's able to take any part of Russia, if Putin's able to take any part of Ukraine, right, even if it's only what they currently occupy, that will embolden him to think that he can take more. There's nothing to stop him from taking more, right? Particularly when it appears that the U.S. is taking the side of Russia, right? I just don't see what will stop him. What he'll do next, I can't fully anticipate that.
So I think we have time for one more question. There's been a hand there in the back, so you can end this off.
Hi, great talk. Loved everything about it. This was actually a question that I heard somebody say earlier, and I believe it was Daniel kind of answered it. Before I ask the question, I just want to kind of lay down a perspective that I have, and please let me know if it's flawed in any way, because I'm just now learning about all of this worldwide. So, the world goes through a Great Depression, and it is argued, historians argue, that it's World War II that really got us out of the Great Depression ultimately. We get the Marshall Act with Europe, basically promising that, hey, you guys do whatever you want, just don't let the Soviets expand into Europe, and we'll do whatever you want. Just don't call it the big spooky word. Call it socialism if you want, but don't call it the big spooky word. And essentially, we're still kind of in the wake of a managed economy, not so much as the pre-Depression, but in a managed economy where we have this economic booms in all these countries and whatnot. But for my question, let me know if that perspective is kind of illogical in any way. What is the fundamental causes of what's happening right now? Because we saw a rise in fascism during the Great Depression, these extremist views, left-right views. So, and I guess it's more holistically. There's not really one underlying issue, but is it the system? And what exactly is going on?
So I hear what you're saying. I guess I would flip around what you started with in terms of the war didn't get us out of the Great Depression. The Great Depression got us into the war. So I would flip those, right? And I would say that many argue that the sort of the rise of right-wing populism or populist autocrats that happen to be primarily ideologically very, very right-wing, that is a product of globalization, right? The fact that there were many losers, there were certainly winners from globalization, but there were more losers from globalization, and those losers concentrated in countries that primarily, working class, right, laborers, and that they are the voting base for many of these right-wing parties, and that it's a reaction to, again, what many people see as positive, globalization, economic development, but they didn't benefit in the same ways. Their jobs went overseas, for example, right? Or they felt threatened by immigration, right? And so as a result, voted for these right-wing parties that were, happy to take their vote and to promote these kinds of views, either because, I mentioned before, either because they share them ideologically, or it's just in their interest economically to do that. But regardless, they have a strong voting base, just like in this country as well. There's a strong voting base for some of these views, right? And many, again, argue that it's a result of globalization, right? Economic development that helps some but disadvantaged others, and it's a backlash to globalization. So some might argue that fascism grew out of the economic inequalities of the Great Depression. And people argue, maybe this is the hopeful point I can end on, and people argue that going forward, we really need to think about is the high degree of inequality, and that if we really want to protect democracy and stability, that we really need to lower the amount of inequality. Inequality is extremely high, not just in this country, but in many other developed countries. And there are a lot of people who are suffering as a result, right? So it's about closing that gap and lowering the level of economic inequality, and then we'll probably have a lot less political polarization.
Okay, so we are just out of time. Yes, thank you so much. So thank you all very much for your attendance and your engagement and fantastic questions. Thank you very much for Dr. Jones for joining us here and for her talk. So this is not the end. I know there were many hands left. So I ask that you all please join us just across the street in Farzaneh Hall, where we'll have a lovely reception with some hors d'oeuvres and appetizers. So I hope to see you there, and thank you all very much for coming.
Oh, the sign.